Hi, this is Patrick. In this video, I'm going to go over some different ways that you can use CSS in Dreamweaver Creative Cloud 2015. Dreamweaver transitioned from earlier versions, CS5, CS6, to where they introduced the CSS designer in current versions, and with that, really changed the way that you can add CSS. But there are still some, I don't know if you want to say legacy ways, but some other ways at least that you can add CSS, if you will, to your page. So with most things in Dreamweaver, there's more than one way to do it. So I mocked up a really quick page here. I saved it, CSS Fun. You can take a peek and you can see my basic sections. I have a container div, I have a header, a nav, a section, and some, heading with some dummy text. All right, so Alright, so the first and perhaps the easiest way to add CSS to Dreamweaver is that you can go up to Modify and you can go to Page Properties. And from here you'll notice that some of these options have the ability to add CSS. And so what this will do is it'll basically add it to the head of your document. If you have a multi-page document, you really want to have an external style sheet. But this is a great and easy way just to get going. So my page font, I'm going to decide, let's add Gotham. And I'm going to set that as normal, and we'll say normal. We'll do size 16, text color, maybe we'll just go with black. Background of the page, I can do, let's go with something like that. And I'm not going to use a background image, and none of this really applies. Over here with left and right, I'm going to say auto for my margins. Then I'm going to jump down to here, links. Okay, so it doesn't like that I used it that way, so let's say no, and let's see, we'll leave it for now. So I'm not sure why it didn't like margin left auto, margin right auto, but we'll move on. Okay, so this is where I can basically do some pseudo classes. So I can decide that, basically I want my links when you roll over them to be, say, this color, and active I can leave, and then I can say, okay, let's just show the underline on the rollover. So my headings, this is where I can leave them as default, but maybe I want to play with the color a little, and I haven't really thought through my color scheme, but we'll leave this for now. We'll go with a much lighter one there for the H2. Okay, so now let's just hit apply and hit OK. So you can see it's basically added this CSS here. Now, it adds sometimes more than you really want, but that's okay. This is a good start. It can get me going. You can notice that it doesn't, though, add certain things that I might want. So, for instance, I might want to add some CSS to my container. So from here, my container, I can, down in the Properties Inspector, click on CSS Designer, or I can jump up here to the CSS Designer page. So I'm going to hit this CSS Designer, and it brings me over here. And so it gives me what it thinks is the selector I want. I'm going to actually just click on Body, and I'm going to click on Properties, and I'm going to add a background color just so I can have a little better contrast here. So right now it's set up where, actually I'm even going to step back, because if you remember, I wasn't even listening to what I said. I don't want to actually do this to the body. I want to do it to my container. So I'm going to hit Container. Then I'm going to add some white there. Okay. So now that I have this, I might also, with the container while I'm here, add a little bit of padding. A little bit of padding goes a long way. Okay. So I'm going to actually make that an H1 tag, because I don't believe I did that earlier. So you can start to see that the page starts to advance. So now we've basically covered that there's the first way is I can add some CSS by going through my page properties. A second way is that I can click on a tag that I want and click down here, make sure it's selected, and go to the CSS Designer panel. And so in this case, I can find my H2, and I could change this color of this H2 So maybe after playing around, I decide, you know, I want to do something more like that. And I could play with the font size more. Perhaps I want the font size to be smaller. I could do something like that. But for now, let's leave it and let's continue on. So now when you're down here and you click on CSS, you'll see that you have other options. And so you can see that right now it's addressing the targeted rule, and there's some other things here. But you'll notice that if I'm selected the H2, that it gives me the ability for the H2. If I click on the H1, it gives me the ability for the H1. So if I decide I want to adjust this H1, rather than jumping into the CSS designer, I can use this properties inspector down here. And so right now, let's say that I decide I want to make this color more like, let's say, a type of green. Okay? And you can see that right away it adjusted that. So one of the other things you can do when you're down here is you'll notice that there's some basic options here. So for instance, let's click on footer. Let's make sure footer is selected. And you notice that it doesn't allow me to do anything. And it's because you'll notice that I haven't done anything with footer. But if I click on this and I jump over here, and now I have footer, and I'm going to actually just make that a little smaller, and I'm going to hit enter return. So now it basically added nothing to my CSS, but it's ready to go now, because you'll notice now I can see my targeted rule is over here for footer. So this is where I can sit here and say, I actually want to make this font a little different. I want to, let's say, make something a little smaller, subtler. But the reason I was able to do that is I already started over here by adding this selector. So that's the first step that you have to do to be able to use this property box, at least this targeted rule. I have to set up the rule. Now you'll notice that it does give me some other options on here. But for now, what I want to focus on is if I'm here and if I click on page properties, what you get here is it opens that page properties back up that we were in earlier. So that's something to be aware of. The other thing that you can do when you're down here is, let's say that I want to add a new rule. So what it does is it basically wants to add some inline style. And so I might decide that this font I want to be a different color. So if I make this red, you'll see what it just did there. It added a span tag and then added that inline new style. So you generally want to avoid this type of use because it can get very messy over time. But it's important to be aware that that inline style is something that it allows you to do right there. So then there comes a point when you have enough stuff that it really makes sense, or you're going to have multiple pages like this where you really want to bring your CSS to an external style sheet. So in this case, what I can do is I can go to New, CSS, Create, and I'm going to take all of this CSS I have, I'm going to cut it, I'm going to add it to this page. Now I'm going to go back here and clean this up a little because I want to get rid of the style there. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to apply source formatting and clean it up a little. I'm going to come back here. I'm going to save this as a CSS file. So I'm going to put this as CSS fun, and I'm going to put it where I put all my CSS files. So I have a folder set up for edtech2, and I have a styles folder. So I'm just going to save it there. So now I can close it, and you notice my styles are gone, but what I can do is now attach that style sheet. So I'm going to go to CSS styles, attach style sheet. I'm going to browse for that style sheet, and I'm going to attach it. So just like that, I've moved the CSS that I originally selected or created in my page properties. I moved it over to an external style sheet of its own. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is I want to show you that once you've set up a rule, let's say my main heading, and I want to edit that. We talked about that I can just make sure it's selected and I can edit it down here. I could also go over to my CSS designer and I could find my H1 tag and I could edit over here. But you can also have this option where you can click Edit Rule. So if I click Edit Rule, it opens in this box that people who've been using Dreamweaver for a long time are very comfortable with. And so in here, this is where I have a lot more options where I could not only change, maybe the font to impact, and I can apply it and start seeing what it looks like, but I can start looking through some of these other options. And so in this case, I can add a background color to, let's say that, and it basically added the background to my H1 tag. And so I can start going down here, and there's a lot more options here that you might not even be aware that you have. And so this is one last way to use CSS. And so to kind of go over everything that we've addressed so far, in Dreamweaver, you can start a page and you can basically go to page properties and you can add some CSS that way, and it's going to add it in the head of your document. Then once you have some CSS, you can edit it by clicking on it, and as long as it's set up already, where you have that rule and selector set up, you can usually make changes to it down here in the Properties Inspector. You can also always go back to your page properties by clicking Page Properties in the Property Inspector, or you can use your CSS Designer. And the last thing I wanted to say is that once a rule has been set up, you can edit it by clicking on the Edit Rule box, and it's going to give you this legacy box that Dreamweaver's had for a long time that really gives you a lot of other options. So sometimes people like, for instance, working through some of these options rather than working through the CSS Designer. But with all that said, it's really nice once your CSS is done to put it in an external file, as I showed you, external style sheet, and then to make sure it's cleaned up and that it's really accomplishing everything you want. And at the end of the day, sometimes you might find that you can get rid of certain bits of CSS because it's not adding anything. If anything, it's just adding more code you don't need. So with that, have fun with Dreamweaver and explore and have fun specifically with CSS. Thanks.